the heat of a living breath, is the smallest light in the world. But when the frozen earth turns to stone, it is the only thing keeping the dark from swallowing you whole.
Ugh.
Yeva pulled the heavy fur hood closer around her face, her breath freezing into delicate white lace against the collar of her outer coat. Beneath 3 layers of stitched reindeer hide, she could feel the faint, rhythmically fluttering pulse of her 3-year-old son, Dan. He was pressed directly against her skin, bound tightly inside her inner parka, his small chest rising and falling in rhythmic shudders. Around them, the twilight was not black, but an endless, suffocating, bruised purple. The quiet, lethal dusk of the late autumn ice plains. Yeva was moving across the vast Mammoth steppe, a windswept gravel plain stretched beneath the shadow of the great northern ice sheet. Her people had already migrated south toward the sheltered river valleys 3 suns ago, following the autumn reindeer herds. She had stayed behind at the summer camp to gather the last dry willow roots and bitter sage, vital medicine for the long, dark months ahead, trusting her youth and her steady stride to catch up before the first deep freeze settled. But the steppe does not keep promises made to humans. As the afternoon light waned, the gentle breeze suddenly shifted into a harsh, dry wind rushing directly down from the glacier peaks. It was a cold that did not merely touch the skin. It bit through the thickest wolf fur, turning the wrapped leather of her boots into rigid, unyielding iron. Within minutes, the ground haze of crushed ice crystals rose like thrown salt, obliterating the horizon, erasing the faint footprints of her band, and blinding her vision. The wooden runner of her light, hauling sled, carved from precious birch and wrapped in wet hide, struck a frozen tussock of sedge and snapped with a sharp crack, like a dry bone. The small bundle of supplies she had been towing pitched sideways into a drift, spilling its contents into the dark. Yeva paused, her breathing raspy in her raw throat. She tried to knot the broken leather toe line with her fingers, but the skin of her hands was already losing its flexibility, stiffening in the biting draft. The wind howled with a rising, resonant pitch, sweeping across the featureless expanse with nothing to break its force. The air turned so cold so quickly that the thin layer of warmth trapped in her clothes began to bleed away. She knew that if she stayed here in the exposed open plain, trying to repair a broken sled while the sun died, the frozen ground would claim them both before the moon reached its peak. She abandoned the sled, hauling only her small flint blade, her birch bark pouch, and her son wrapped tight against her chest. She stepped forward into the swirling white gloom, searching for a gully, a boulder, or a hollow in the earth, anything that might break the killing edge of the gale. By the time the sky turned completely dark, the landscape had flattened into a limitless sea of scoured gravel and hard blue ice. The wind had swept the ground so clean that there were no snowdrifts deep enough to cut a cave, no rock outcrops, no fallen timber, nothing but flat, frozen earth exposed to the storm. Yeva's legs began to tremble violently. Every step felt as though she were dragging heavy stones through wet mud. The bitter cold crept through the thick seams of her reindeer skin parka, seams she had painstakingly sewn with fine bone needles and dried reindeer sinew back in the warmth of the summer camp. The sinew was snapping under the intense frost, opening microscopic gaps in the leather that let the razor wind slide directly onto her shivering skin. Exhaustion knocked her down to her knees. She hit the icy gravel hard, the breath forced from her lungs in a faint cloud of white vapor. She scrambled to her hands and knees, trying to stand, but her thigh muscles cramped into tight knots that refused her command. Desperation seized her throat. She fumbled at her waist for her pouch, pulling out a precious scrap of dry birch bark and a handful of dried moss soaked in melted fat. She held them down in the shelter of her own body, bringing her iron pyrite striker against a sharp piece of flint to catch a spark. Sparks showered onto the tinder, glowing bright orange for a second, but before the dry moss could catch the ember, a sudden blast of wind ripped beneath her elbow. The tinder was snatched from her stiffened fingers, whirled up into the darkness, and scattered across the ice plain in a fraction of a heartbeat. Her last means of creating fire was gone. She sat back on her heels in the open terrain, surrounded by a roaring void, with no shelter, no warmth, and no strength left to walk. The cold was no longer just around her, it was inside her, tightening around her ribs like a heavy cord, pulling the lingering strength from her shivering frame. In the quiet core of her terror, Yeva felt a sickening change against her chest. Dan had stopped wriggling, his small, restless murmurs. The tiny complaints he had been making against the harsh wind had completely ceased. Panicked, she reached inside the warm fold of her parka, her numb fingertips sliding over his soft cheek. His skin, normally radiating the fierce, bubbling heat of a young child, felt smooth and chillingly cool, like polished river stone. His breathing had grown faint, so light and slow that she could barely feel the gentle puff of air against her thumb. "Dan," she called out, her voice cracked and thin against the booming wind. "Dan, open your eyes, my heart. Look at Mama." He did not respond. His head lolled against her collarbone, his eyelids heavy and purple in the dim starlight. She knew this silence. She had seen it take the old people in the deep winter moons. The quiet, painless drifting away as the body surrenders its inner fire to the frost. Her own mind was beginning to fog. A heavy, tempting drowsiness tugged at her eyelids, whispering that it would be so easy to lie down on the ice, close her eyes, and rest alongside her child. But the fierce instinct of motherhood roared back against the creeping slumber. She refused to let the cold take him. On her hands and knees, dragging her deadened legs across the frozen crust, she crawled forward into the blinding drift, clutching Dan tightly against her ribs with one arm. Then, her forward shoulder struck something immense. It was not a rock. It lacked the sharp, unyielding bite of stone. It was soft, dense, and covered in a thick, coarse blanket of tangled hair that smelled faintly of dry grass and old earth. She reached out, feeling the towering, curved mass rising out of the snowbank like a small hill. It was a giant steppe mammoth, a massive bull that had collapsed into a shallow drainage ditch, likely during the last heavy mudslide before the big freeze. Its gigantic body lay frozen on its side, partially sheltered from the wind by the bank of the dry riverbed. Yeva pressed her face against the beast's thick brown fur, sobbing in frustration, thinking it was merely another cold wall. But as she laid her bare cheek against the skin beneath the dense outer wool, she felt something impossible. The sheer, massive bulk of the creature, thousands of pounds of thick dermal fat and dense muscle, had retained a deep, residual core of thermal energy. Deep within its massive torso, untouched by the surface frost, the warmth of its life had not yet fully vanished into the frozen earth. Yeva did not hesitate. Her mind ignited with a clear, radical purpose. She drew her primary flint tool from her belt, a thick, carefully napped burin with a stout, razor-like point. Her hands were clumsy, her fingers stiffened into claw-like shapes. But she used both hands, leveraging her whole body weight, to press the sharp flint blade into the underbelly of the mammoth, where the skin was softest and protected from the wind. The thick hide yielded with a tough, tearing sound. Beneath the outer skin lay a layer of dense, pale blubber, nearly 4 inches thick, that acted as a natural thermal shield, trapping the interior heat inside the carcass while keeping the Arctic cold out. Working with desperate, methodical force, Yeva cut a long, arched seam along the belly ribs. She sliced through the soft connective tissue and fat, peeling back a wide flap of thick hide to reveal the hollow space within the massive, arched ribcage. A cloud of warm, earthy vapor rushed out from the cavity, smelling of damp soil and digested meadow herbs. It was not the cold breath of the tundra, but the trapped, golden warmth of the living world. Carefully, Yeva pulled Dan close, cradling his limp form in her arms. She hauled herself up into the opening, crawling deep inside the sheltered chamber formed by the giant's curved ribs and thick insulating walls of fat. She pulled the heavy flap of mammoth hide back over the entrance, sealing out the roaring blizzard, sealing out the killing wind, and enclosing them in the dark, quiet womb of the beast. Inside, the air was still and thick with biological heat. The temperature was decades warmer than the frozen world outside. Yeva unbuttoned her inner coat, stripping off her outer gloves, and pressed Dan's cold cheek directly against her bare skin. She wrapped her thick inner fur wrapped tight around both of them, rocking him in the deep velvet darkness. "I'm here," she whispered softly into his dark hair, her voice vibrating through her chest into his small body. "I've got you, my little son. Sleep now. The big bull has us." Minutes passed in the heavy darkness, measured only by the rhythmic whistling of the wind outside the thick walls of hide. Slowly, wonderfully, she felt a sudden, small twitch against her skin. Dan drew a long, shuddering gasp of warm air. His small hands reached out blindly, clutching at her tunic, and his forehead pressed warm and damp into the hollow of her throat. The color was returning to his cheeks. His heart was beating fast and strong again against her ribs. Ugh. A wave of profound, overwhelming relief washed over Yeva, tears spilling hot down her cheeks as she held her living child in the safe, quiet heart of the ancient giant. When the morning came, the violent gale had died down to a gentle, whispery breeze. Bright, crystalline sunlight streamed through a narrow slit in the hide flap, illuminating the tiny frost crystals floating in the quiet air inside the shelter. Yeva pushed the heavy hide flap open and crawled out into the brilliant white world. The air was crisp and clear, the blue sky stretching wide over the sparkling, undisturbed snowfields. She stood on the firm ice, holding Dan in her arms. He was awake now, his dark eyes wide with childish wonder as he reached out a tiny fur-mittened hand to touch the vast, curved ivory tusk rising above them into the morning light. There was no predator defeated here, no grand battle fought with spears or fire, only a mother's relentless refusal to let go, and the quiet, miraculous gift of an ancient beast that had kept the cold at bay for one more night. In that stillness, Yeva bowed her head against the frozen skin of the mammoth, offering a quiet murmur of gratitude to the giant that had given its body to save her line. How often do we forget that human survival was never just a story of triumph over nature, but a quiet, humble agreement between the living and the dead to keep the flame of life burning in the dark,